Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 109. Dedicated in honor of Yisrael Shal Goodman, born on the 10th of Adar Sheni this year. We'll begin with the timely element, Leben mit der Zeit, as the Alter Rebbe said, to live with the time. And when he was later asked, what did he mean by living with the times? So the Mittler Rebbe explained to live with the Parsha that we learn in that time. So when you think about it, even though it's a very common expression, it's really giving us also a deeper understanding of what time is, as well as a deeper understanding of our lives, and how time plays a central role in the journey of our souls through this lifetime and the next. Because time continues on, as we know, and time is energy, as abundantly explained in the Zohar, and Avram Zok and Baba Yomim, and Chassidus explains it at length. And that time, every moment of time, is a life of its own. That's why it says Sheishis Yomim Osa Hashem Es Hashemayim V'Sar. It's not Bisheishis Yomim, because it's called Yema V'Yema Oved. It should have said during 6 days, or in the period of 6 days. When you say Sheishis Yomim, it's like saying 6 days were created by God. And the Zohar says that indeed that's the fact, because time is a creation, and every day has its particular function, its particular energy. Sunday is the energy of Chesed, Monday the energy of Gvura, and so on. This is somewhat of a tangent, but it's always interesting to add elements from Chassidus to explain life, and what physics today knows as being, they say man, time, space, and man. We know there's Olam Shana Nefesh, that goes back thousands of years, that the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, which is attributed to Avram Avinu, is built on Olam Shana Nefesh, space, Olam, Shana, time, and Nefesh is soul. That's the triad, the triangle. So as we come, every period of time has for us many lessons that are connected to the time, whether it's the chapter we read, whether it's the holidays, or other events. Time is energy, which deserves its own discussion. But for now, let that suffice. So we are now coming from the days of Purim. I hope everybody had a very lebedika and fredeldika Purim, a joyous, celebrated beyond unbridled joy and beyond any limits and limitations, as we discussed. And now we're entering into the period between Purim and Pesach, and specifically as we go into the next week will be Parshas Shemini, as well as being the Movarchem HaChedesh Nisan, we're blessing the month of Nisan, as well as another parsha that's read, the 4 parshas, Shkolim, Zocher, then Parah, and then HaChedesh, and that's the order. So we're now in the third of these Dalit parshas, the third of these 4, it's called Parsha Parah. That's an additional reading that is read in the week before, always before the Chedesh. So let's talk a few moments about these different elements in the context of Chassidus Applied. We'll start with Parshas Parah, being that's the Chiddush. So Parshas Parah is a central theme of Chassidus, in the Maimorim of Likutei Torah, Chukas. As a matter of fact, one of the springboards of MyLife, Chassidus Applied, when we first began, was, I think in the first or second episode, I spoke about a theme of Parshas Parah, because it's one of those that jump out at you as being so relevant, where you see seemingly an obscure chukah of all things, a super rational mitzvah that are not even applicable today in the literal sense. Taking a parah aduma, a red heifer, which is a rarity, and using the ashes of the efer that remains after you bring this offering, mixing with mayim chayim, and this combination of fire and water, of ash and water, is what's sprinkled upon and has the mysterious secret power of healing from the illness called death, to the point that even Moshe Rabbeinu was disturbed and did not know, how can you purify from such a impurity? Which just compounds the question, what exactly is this mysterious mitzvah? And Chassidus comes, and though it's a chukah, and it's one of the chukim that even Shlomo Melech says, that I was able to understand everything, but this is a mitzvah I cannot understand. Yet Chassidus, Alter Rebbe, Likutei Torah, chukas, explains it in the context of that, and that's called Zeis Chukas HaTorah. Zeis Chukas HaTorah. This is the chukah of Torah. So it's like saying this is the quintessential law or super rational law of Torah. What does that mean? So he explains because the essential Kol HaTorah, the entire Torah of Judaism, you could say the entire life is built on these two poles, the polar opposites of fire and water, Chesed and Gvura. Or as he puts it there, Rotzeh and Shuv, yearning and returning, sometimes translated as tension and resolution. And if you think about life, everything about life requires a tension and a resolution. From our heartbeats to our breathing, to everything that's mobile, life, pulsating energy requires a positive and a negative. Just like the heart contracts and then expands, exhale, inhale, everything is that type of dance. You look at a cardiogram and you see the perfect cycle, the perfect wave that goes up and down, and that's the way it should be. And that signifies and is symbolic of all of what life is all about, as he explains there, because in Avedis Hashem, in this person's service, you need two elements. One is that you need to have a certain measure of angst to seek for something that's beyond you, and then you need resolution to internalize it. You'll see all maladies, especially psychological ones, come from an imbalance. Either there's too much angst, which leads to anxiety, too much frustration of not having something you want to have. We're talking about, obviously, we're looking for something healthy, or too much resolution. You're too comfortable. Everything is fine, everything is cool. Perfect growth consists of always looking upward and climbing toward that, and then internalizing it, and then you look and you reach a greater horizon. But in addition, he explains there also the concept of the burning of the ash, the Efer, the burning of the Parah Aduma to leave Efer. And he explains that this the idea of leaving Efer, leaving just plain Efer, ash, is the idea of breaking down elements that fire is able to achieve, which fire here is bittul. The breaking down of elements, that if a person was immersed in something we'll call a mini death, and a mini death would be every form of disconnecting from your life source, from your purpose. So think of life is a form of energy, and it needs to have its life source. What's its life source? The purpose of this energy. Why were we sent here? So every Aveda, which means displacement, Aveda from the word Havara, Reshus, Reshus, moving away, displacement or misalignment from where you should be, creates a little cutoff. So death is essentially the idea of cutting off from the source. A connection to a life force. When we're not connected to a life force, as an example given sometimes in Chassidus, the Frierdiker Rebbe brings this mashal from a diver actually. So there are two types of divers underwater. There's of course scuba diving, and there's divers deep sea diving that would go down with a very heavy gear, and they would be connected with a pipe that would give them the oxygen. It wasn't oxygen on their back, with a pipe. So the Frierdiker Rebbe brings this in one of the Maimorim, early in the Pays, I believe, where he writes that imagine if this pipe, God forbid, gets severed. That's your life source. Now if you think of 613 pipes, 613 strands of energy are the mitzvahs, the 248 positive, the 365 negative. There's a life sustenance. This is not just a matter of a luxury. As such, when a person in some way severs that connection, that's a mini death, spiritual death. So how do you heal from such a death? What you have to do is you burn down the elements. You burn down the passion, which is the blood. And that's the dam, the tichas adam, the passion. And the tainug and the taiva, the pleasure, which is the chelev, the fat. And you burn it down to its bare element, and what are you left with? Ash. So something is left. And he explains there the fascinating idea of the koyach hamesava versus the taiva. That when a person has a desire, an inappropriate desire, and they act on it, God forbid, there are two elements to it. There's the power to desire, and that's, he says, you say dose b'harei kedesh. That's rooted in a very high place. The power to desire. The object of desire. That is what needs to be burned. But you're left then with only the power, and then you can redirect it. And we discussed this back then. I just thought it's reminiscent. When we come to Parshas Parah, it reminds us of this idea. And here you have, right in Parah itself, two tremendous lessons of Chassidus about applying to our personal lives the Rotzev Veshuv idea and the idea of transforming our power of desire to direct it to the right objectives and not the wrong ones. Explained in Likutei Torah, Parsha Chukas. As far as Parsha Shemini goes, there are many themes as well. You also have a fire story in Parsha Shemini, the Eish Zara, the strange or foreign fire that consumed Nadav and Avihu in their passionate effort going into the Holy of Holies. The temple was built, it was erected, and was just finished that day. Shemini, the 8th day, means the 8th day of when they began the Shiva Simei Miluyim, the 7 days of training, of knowing how to serve in the temple, and there is Eira Chaim rites, and cited in Chassidus, especially in different Mamor Achrei Meis Tafresh Mem Tes from the Rebbe Rashab, as well as other places. The Rebbe speaks about it often. In many sichos, in their passion, as he says, in their love and their chashek and their tremendous wish to cleave and to connect and to be consumed by the divine, they ran into the Holy of Holies, and because they weren't fully prepared, it wasn't nichnush b'shalom v'yotzer b'shalom, as Rabbi Akiva went into the Parshas, into the orchard, which is always signifies a type of spiritual experience, unlike the other three who did not go in peace, like Nadav Avihu. So one went mad in the case of Rabbi Akiva, one died, literally, like Nadav Avihu did. One became an apostate, Acher. Rabbi Akiva went and entered in peace, came out in peace. Eidos Bekelim. Because when you have these tremendous energies, any type of spiritual awakening, if you don't have the proper containers to contain it, it can overwhelm you. And it was Akadusha, B'Kadeshi. The Eibishter says to Moshe that B'Kadeshi, I'll be sanctified. And Moshe thought it would meant him and Aaron. And at the end of the day, it already meant Nadav and Avihu. They sanctified God's name. But still it was considered not an appropriate behavior, but not out of their, God forbid, weakness, but because of their strength. Because they went with too much passion and without that containment. B'Krevi HaKadosh is the Lashon. My close ones I will become sanctified by. And Moshe thought it meant him and Aaron, and they're being Nadav and Avihu. And because of that, we learn from Nadav and Avihu, 2 chapters later, Shemini Sazim Mitzera Achlev, 3 chapters later, Bezeis Yoveh, that now we'll know how to enter the Holy of Holies in the proper way that should be containable. So the laws of Yom Kippur are really a result of what happened to Nadav Avihu, and by them it was an Eish Zara that caused it to happen, a foreign fire, which of course the lesson to us is a tremendous one in many ways. Everybody has a tremendous amount of energy in their soul, more than you may even imagine. Sometimes you act on it, sometimes you may not even know it. So many people think okay, I wish I could access that passion. But passion has also its tremendous challenges, because the more creative you are, the more energetic you are, the more power you have. If you don't have the right balance and discipline, it can end up consuming you. And it's a critical component also in the Ratzeh V'Shuv balance of knowing how to contain powerful energy, harness it, and channel it. Which brings me to a theme that is, of course, in Chassidus is discussed, but the Rebbe brought it down practically in the year Tovshin Chav Gimel. It was this Parshas Shabbos, Parshas Shemini, and that's when the Rebbe came out with the Gzeira. Just a moment. Sorry about that. He came out then with the Gzeira, the takana of drinking only 3 cups, as he said it then, and later added 4 small cups for people under 40. And he began, it says in this Pasha, Yain v'shecher al teisht, that wine and beer you shall not drink. And said, even though it's talking about the Kohanim, the time of the Beis HaMikdash, it applies as well to today. And when you look at the Rebbe's letters and the Rebbe's different sichos on this topic, you see very clearly that in our day and age, it's very clear not the way to serve God. We're not going to go now into the past. I'm not going to discuss this topic. I think I discussed it back when. But regardless, if it's a topic to be addressed, I'll address it another time. But just to give you an example on how adamant the Rebbe was, that this is not a derech and aveda. And using this pasuk and applying it to Chassidim, applying it to saying l'chaim, applying it to make kiddush on mashke and so on and so forth. The Rebbe then said, Purim, he doesn't want to get involved, but later even with Purim, the Rebbe made limitations. But the bottom line is that this theme addresses a fundamental issue, especially in our day and age. They have people who unfortunately can be dressed up in all kinds of garments, but it's not a Torah thing. To become someone who's addicted to or dependent on any object is Eish Zara. We're only dependent on one thing, which is God. Mashke becomes an end in itself, then it is no different than what was called samim, which is called drugs. The whole purpose, if it ever has had a purpose, was only a means to a certain end, but not something, God forbid. And there are families that have been challenged tremendously. Lives have been destroyed. Families have been destroyed to people literally not listening to this Gzeira. And the Rebbe wasn't just a Gzeira, a Ruchnizik Gzeira. The Rebbe understood the time, understood what the Aved is of our times. You want to take your passion and channel it the right way. Foreign substances, including wine and alcohol and so on, are not the way you channel your Ruchnizik and spiritual passions. So that is yet another lesson connected to this section, to this Parsha. And with this, we shall move into now the topics at hand. Since we're talking about simcha, we're talking about passion, so let's go straight to the topic about joy. Why is joy so vital? We know that in the Torah there's so much focus on being joyous. Ivdus Hashem b'simcha, tachas shelo yavartas Hashem elakecha b'simcha v'tov levav. The importance of serving with joy. And the Alter Rebbe, chapter 26, cites it, and he writes at the end there, Ki yidua what the Arizal says about it. In other words, the importance, the fundamental importance. The Rebbe said that this is especially true in our times. In this month of Adar, in which we, being happy, should be the center of our attention, can you please explain what true happiness is and why it is so vital? So, of course, Mishanichnas Adar Marbin B'Simcha. When you enter Adar, you increase in Simcha, and the emphasis, of course, increase, because it should always be joy. Increasing in joy, especially this year with the 2 months of Adar, it's even more joy, because every day is Ma'alim B'Kedesh, we grow in this type of joy. So it's a very basic question, and there's many ways to address joy, and frankly, from a point of view of Chassidus Applied, it actually is one of the most powerful tools in living a healthy life. Many people say, if my life was better, I'd have what to be joyous about. And the answer Chassidus says, if you were joyous, your life would be better. Yes, it's somewhat of a postulate from Trach good, V'zayin good, think good and it will be good, positive thinking and so on, but it goes deeper than that. Simchas HaNefesh. The soul on its own is a joyous entity. Because the soul, before it comes to this world, is constantly, in a sense, think of a fish in water. It senses its source, and therefore revels in it and flourishes in it. Like you see a flower that's being watered. Look at the flower; it's a joyous flower. A flower that's deprived, that is not nurtured, that will shrivel. So a neshama in its natural state is a joyous entity, which is why children are born naturally happy. I'm not talking about exceptions or due to some other factors, illness, God forbid, or a mother's pregnancy that may have caused different issues for a child and deprived the child of certain things. We're talking about in the healthy, proper way, the child is naturally joyous and happy, which tells us that the human being is not a neutral state and you have to learn about joy. We are naturally joyous. Then life begins to take over, because the neshama comes into this world, as Chassidus explains, and has to deal with the hardships. Beginning with the concealment, it's no longer in its natural waters. It has to contend with a body, what we call a nefesh habamis, an animal soul that has all kinds of other distractions. And though those short-term comforts sometimes argue in the name of joy, why don't you be joyous? Do something right now that's instant gratification. The soul is slowly being parched, slowly being starved, and dying from thirst and hunger for spiritual nourishment. So joy is really not just an act where someone says, oh, I did this, I was happy. Joy is an innermost soulful experience that comes from the soul being fed and nourished and nurtured. So when a person doesn't have joy, it's not just, oh, I'm not joyous. They're basically depriving themselves of the most important oxygen that they need. So you say, one second, if things are not going so well, how could I have joy? Well, that's a good question. How does the Torah say, Ivdus Hashem b'simcha, tev leiv mishta tamid, always be joyous? Because you'll see people, even those that may have poverty issues, God forbid, or other issues, the joy of their nefesh never disappears. And that becomes an asset for them to be able to actually help them fight and overcome their challenges. In this modern society, we've learned to associate joy with objects, objectified joy. Do this, you'll be happy. Buy this, you'll be happy. Smoke this, you'll be happy. Travel here, dress like this, look like that. Come here, go there. What about just take everything away and no objects? Is there an inner joy of just being alive? Now, many of us says, well, I grew up in a home, in an environment where they did not celebrate life. I had parents that were miserable. They made me feel miserable. Obviously, these are challenges. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But to go and say, I will not be joyous because I have these challenges, you're basically depriving yourself of the single tool, most important tool, to fight these despondent feelings. So that's why joy is so critical. So how do you achieve it? It's exactly the same way. You have to feed your soul. You're not going to have joy from just doing instant gratifying elements. They'll give you joy like a sugar rush, but then it will go away and it will want more. You have to feed your soul. There's no shortcuts, ifs or buts. Secondly, you have to be around people who feed their souls and who are joyous. Those two things are the main elements that can help you get from a place of where you are to a more joyous and happier place. And that despite what your circumstances are, it's a myth to say, if my life was easier, I'd be a more joyous person. You see people who have everything God blessed them with, and they're miserable. And you have people who seemingly are deprived of everything material, and they're tremendously happy. I'm not saying the rule, it could be either way. Obviously it could be deprived and also be miserable, or the other way around. But that just proves to you, if there's enough people, and not exceptions, that are one or the other, that tells you that it's not dependent on objects, it's not dependent on acquisition, it's not dependent on your life circumstances. It's dependent on a force that comes from within, inside out, not outside in. So this is the theme of joy in general, and specifically it comes to the month of Adar. I want to read a note that came my way from the Rebbe. So for Chassidim this has even more power, and I'll address after this why is it relevant more today than ever. The Rebbe writes, Kama v'kama pomim b'kashti v'irarti shebechlal u'befrad b'zman hazeh tzarich li's b'simcha v'chul. Many times I've requested and I've made people aware, aroused in people that in general, especially in our times, you have to be b'simcha. You must be joyous. Then the Rebbe continues, move on, and it's understood. Shebe'ima hashaychim Elai, that if those that have a connection or a relationship with me, who besimcha, that those that have a connection with me will be besimcha bejoy, poil ze gam bi, that will also affect me. Umechlal hein atashemeya chulu, and from the positive you can derive chulu. The Rebbe doesn't even want to say what the negative is, etc. Which is a fascinating answer here. In other words, besides the fact, obviously each of us have joy, we are dependent on each other. And the Rebbe is saying, those that have a relationship with me, when they are happy, it affects my happiness, my simcha. And of course the opposite as well. Now why Bizman Hazeh more than other times? Now if you go back to what I explained, you can also understand a number of sikhs, especially in the later years, when the Rebbe spoke, Kapasha Kisove Tovshin Nun Aleph, that Ein Adov V'Tali Ela B'Simcha, that Mashiach, maybe the only thing left is joy. Because we live in a time where spirituality is starving. Simple as that. There's more materialism. There's an expression in the Zohar, tuk for the gufa, chulsha de nishmasa. When the body is more powerful, the soul is weaker. This doesn't mean, the Rebbe explains, a contradiction to what it says that a person should have a healthy body, and the Mezritcher Maggid says that a small hole in the body is like a big hole in the neshama. This is talking about materialism, indulgence in materialism, which has never been unprecedented the way it is today, you see also brings an unprecedented misery. The misery index of our time is no doubt greater than ever before, and also the prosperity and the opportunities and everything that we have availabilities in our time has been unprecedented. So I don't have to be a rocket scientist to correlate the two. What is most necessary in our times is that joyous attitude, the joy that comes from the neshama, the soulful joy, is critical in a time like this because we need it now more than ever. It's always been necessary. But when people lived with less material options and lived in a very diminished and you can say in a more impoverished state, by nature they were more soulful because that's all they had. They didn't have something to rely on or as a crutch. But when you have the sugar candies and you have all the good gadgets and all the distractions, this is where the soul and the joy, that true joy that comes, permanent joy, is critical. And think of it this way, just ask yourself the question. When you're doing something, is this thing going to give you something that's lasting? Is it something that's also going to help others? Is it going to be something that lifts you up and you feel good about long term? These are three most important questions. When you see a joy that doesn't last, and doesn't help, is not productive. And it does not lift you up, it demoralizes you ultimately, you can know right away that it's not coming from simchas hanefesh. True joy is when it's coming from within, and it has all those three elements. It's permanent, it affects positively yourself and everybody around you, and it lifts you up to another place. So, I wanted to read one more note, since I was talking about mashke before, because since in that context, let me just read this. So this really belongs earlier. If we were able to quickly edit it, I would just move it. I saw someone wrote to the Rebbe these words: "Le nivra zav ela b'shvil beis hamikdash." This gold was created nothing for no other reason except for the Beis Hamikdash. And he continues, "V'le nivra yayin saraf ela b'shvil chasidim." And mashke, alcohol was created only before chassidim. So then he continues, "Enough in the Darkei Chassidim." Chassid is the person writing to the Rebbe. This is all the person writing. One of the ways of Chassidus is as Chassidim gather together, a little mashke. So he continues on, why? To reveal the inner pneumius. I don't see the rest of the note. But the Rebbe did not exactly take well to this note that was written to him. So what the Rebbe did was, by it says, Le Nivra Zav, he put a parenthesis, that says in Bereshis Rabbah, Tezayin Beis. That gold was created, the gold was not created except for the temple, for the Beis HaMikdash, for the whole. And then he goes by, Ne Livra Saraf, about mashke, about alcohol created for Chassidim, the Rebbe puts in parentheses, in contrast to the Medrash Rabbah, Bereshis Rabbah, Litzonis, meaning mockery, meaning humor. V'zeu Achievable Divra Razal lahavdil. And this is the correlation you make to the words of Razal, lahavdil, separating them with the exclamation point. And then when the person wrote Eina from the Darkei Chassidus, the Rebbe wrote Hamokra al zeh b'divrei Nesi Chassidus. Can you tell me the source of this? In the words of Nesi, the Rebbe underlines Nesi Chassidus, the leaders of Chassidim. The Chassidim come up with something does not make it a Chassidish thing. The leaders of Chassidus. And Rebbe writes, question mark, exclamation point, Va'ayim b'lekutei diburim tafshin yutes seif amid beis. Well, everybody can go ahead and look. And the Rebbe says once in a Fabrengen that when the Rebbe writes Va'ayin, here underlined twice, means it's a tzivui, it's a command to go look. Lekutei diburim tafshin yutes seif amid beis. Okay, I wanted to add that in context of discussion that we said before by Yayin v'Shecher. Okay. Are there any drawbacks to expressing individuality? Where is the line between a nonconformist and a renegade? One of my favorite topics, as you may know. So here's what one person writes. You often speak about the pitfalls of conformity and the importance of cultivating one's individuality in Judaism, which imbues the experience with personal vitality and ensures that we not be mechanical Jews. I find this very refreshing and understand how owning your faith and commitment through individual expression is vital to a dynamic Torah life. At the same time, however, isn't there concern for rebellion against structure, not in the name of leadership and individuality, but as an end in itself, or for other ulterior or even unhealthy reasons due to personal grievances and the like? What is the yardstick for expressing individuality safely and wholesomely? Where is the line between a nonconformist and a renegade? At times I find people adamantly arguing for individuality, while ironically not tolerating other opinions than their own. Another questioner writes, today, from where I'm sitting, a very large portion of those strongly against conforming suffer from the condition that they rebel just for the sake of rebelling, not as a means to express individuality. I believe that the people who are really comfortable with themselves can conform without feeling that they are sacrificed. What is the proper approach to conforming individuality? How do we make sure that it's not misplaced rebellion? Okay. So, excellent question. And of course, the Torah addresses it very directly, because on one hand, as I mentioned many times, Lefikach nivra adam yechidi, the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin. Why was a person created as an individual, not as a part of a herd or a group? Precisely not to have a herd mentality. Because a chayiv adam lemer, a person should say, I am responsible, not out of arrogance, but out of responsibility. B'shvili nivra ela. We stood at Mount Torah, and everything was said Loshen Yochid, even though millions of people stood there. And in Hebrew we know when you speak to a group, you say Lochem, But it doesn't say Anochi Hashem Elokeichem, it says Anochi Hashem Elokecha, as if one person was there. Kabed es avicha ve'esimecha, not avichem ve'imechem. Lo signevu is what you say to a group, not lo signev. And the answer the Medrash says, because everyone standing there was listening, heard as if we're speaking only to him and no one else. To him or her and no one else. Why? Because the Torah is about the individual. We do not sacrifice the individual for the group. And yet we have the concept al tifresh min hatzibur. Coming up Pesach, we say about the Rasha, because he separates himself from the tzibur. There's the idea of coming together and a group, and of course, you'll have only anarchy if everybody just follows their individual routes. So how do you balance the two? The answer is with bittul. Chassidus, this is the biggest questions of Kabbalah and Chassidus. How do you balance the riboy hanivroim with achdus apshuta? Divine unity with the multitude of so many different variations of Ein Deis Ein Shavis. People have different opinions, like Ein Partzefei and Shavis, like we have different faces. And you have tens and tens of sikhs from the Rebbe that speak about it in practical terms. Chassidus talks about it in Haskalah terms, in Avedadika terms. At the end of the day, it comes down to both are divine. Kishem sheyesh lekeche bebilti balgvul, as the Avedas HaKedesh says, just like as God has the power in the infinite, which means a total infinity, so too he has the power in the gvul, in the limit. And the same divine experience you can have with everyone is also in the individual. So we are really both. Amen anili mili, as Hillel said. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Clearly an individualistic statement, if you ever heard one. Manila atzmi, he continues, if I'm only for myself, what will I be? Is that a contradiction? No. We see any good project. Everyone is contributing their particular role. And then you come together, and there's a synergy of everyone doing their role, and it comes together, and you have a unit that's more than the sum of the parts. From my flesh I behold God. Look at the human body. 75 trillion cells. Trillion. Thousands of systems. Even just take one piece of food in your mouth, and how many systems have to be coordinated. And each one has to do their role. They can't be doing someone else's role. And precisely through doing their individual role, they complement the entire picture. Now we have free will, so as opposed to musical notes in one large symphony, each of our notes can go ahead and decide, God forbid, to do whatever, to sing our own song and ignore everyone else. And Torah and Halacha deals with this issue, where what happens if there's a contradiction. If the greater good contradicts the individual right. Well, some situations, there's compromising the individual. Sometimes you have to compromise the greater good. And the Rebbe brings this in Halachas, Rambam. If, for example, God forbid in a negative sense, there's a beautiful Rishim about this from the early years, where the Rebbe talks about the difference between actually the Axis during World War II and the shit of democracy, that there everything is the common good. And they compromised, and not just compromised, annihilated individual rights in the name of the good of the group. Socialism in its worst was that way. There was socialism that's a healthier socialism. And the Rebbe brings, of course, the halacha that if there's a city of 1,000 people and an enemy surrounds it and says, give us one person or we'll save the rest of you, you're not allowed to choose a person to give them. It's one person, 999 people will be saved because of the power of an individual nefesh achas miYisrael. One soul is like an entire universe. Israel is criticized when they do the negotiations and returning how many terrorists to get back one body to bury, etc. This is all the negative. And the positive, obviously, meruba midateva, even more so. So there's this balance that we constantly need. Now, there are definitely people, no question about it, who are conformists in an unhealthy way. And there are definitely people who are non-conformists in an unhealthy way. Nobody has a monopoly on being a pioneer. You can have non-conformists that are very, very healthy, and they are pioneers. Avram Avinu is the ultimate non-conformist. That's why it's called Avram Ivri. Why Ivri? Because he stood on one side of the river and the rest of the world was on the other. He separated himself from the entire world. And that's what the birth of Yiddishkeit was born with, this pioneer. He did not conform. Lech lecha ma'atzecha malatcha mebeis avicha. And we learn this time and again how one has to get out of our comfort zone. In personal Aveda, look at chapter 15 in Tanya. Even if you learn 100 times and it's your custom and it's your pattern and routine, it's not Aveda. Aveda is getting out of your comfort zone. Non-conformity. You're sent here to be unique and to contribute your unique voice, not mine, not someone else's. At the same time, a healthy nonconformist and healthy pioneer is not going to step on other people. Will also know where you have to silence your own voice for the good of the people. The bittul that's necessary. It's not coming from a non-bittul-dika place. So you can have arrogant conformists, you can have arrogant nonconformists. And I think it's not conformity that defines the person. It's the person that defines the person. Chochem mahu emer. Rasha mahu emer, as the Frierdiker Rebbe says. Who he is, that's what he says. Mahu, what he is, that's what he says. So you have to look at the people's attitudes. When you see people in the name of liberalism and openness, and everybody's opinion is right, and then when you start saying something they don't like, and they criticize you, it speaks for itself. A lot of people like to say, I'm out of the box. But what box are you first before you say you're out of the box? So there's a lot to say about this topic, and it's hard to really give a general, a specific formula. I can give a general formula. But generally it comes down to how you see how people tolerate others. If someone is so open-minded, then they would respect and understand that there's some people who respect the structure and they should be in the structure. More importantly, even the greatest nonconformists from a Torah point of view, from a human point of view, we all have structures. We are created as human beings. We need to sleep, we need to eat. The question is whether your structure defines you or not. The whole point of the structure should be a structure that helps you transcend structure, which is what Chassidus teaches us. How from Gvul we come to Bli Gvul, and we come to realize that the Gvul and Bli Gvul that I mentioned before are two forces of the divine. Keiche begvul, keiche bebilta bagvul, that rooted in the Yechelis, God's power to do Bli Gvul and God's power to do Bli Gvul, till the point that they become united as one, because what difference does it make in God's Yechelis, whether it's the power to do this or the power to do that? So ultimately the Gvul of the world, as Chassidus speaks about a Gvul Atzmi, speaks what's a Agbola Atzmis, Samach Vov and Anayim Beis and other places talk about it, that if you choose to confine yourself in this place and no one's imposing on you, that's true. That's not a real Gvul. That's a Gvul that's chosen. So the mitzvahs and Torah and the structure of Torah and mitzvahs was not meant to confine us. It was meant to permeate a world of structure and come to teach us that this is the will of God to be in this structure. And the will to be in structure is just as powerful as the will to be outside of structure. When a person is able to speak that language and live up to that language, you know they're in the right direction. So, most cases you could see from the results, Evan Abayich and litmus test to see the results of a renegade will have negative results, like I spoke before about pleasure. A nonconformist that's coming from an unhealthy place will be a naysayer, will not motivate people, will be very negative, will always be criticizing the system. A person who's a nonconformist in a pioneering Avraham Avinu way, Moshe Rabbeinu way, Rebbe way, will always look how to make the system grow. Will use their pioneering spirit to not be trapped by the conventional fears and trappings of any system, and learn how do you make it grow and come to a greater place instead of destroying it. Rashbi, coming out of the Meira after 12 years, everything he looked at burnt. The 13th year, when he matured, the Bar Mitzvah year, he's able, wherever he goes, he repairs. So he uses his out-of-the-box and his nonconformist attitude to make the world a better place, to make a community a better place. That, to me, is the ultimate test. Okay. Now, the next question is parents, family threatened, and tensions as a result of frumkeit and religion. So here's the question. My spouse and I have recently become more Torah observant, and it is causing serious tensions with our siblings and families. Family gatherings are becoming a nightmare. What would you advise? As it is with all dramatic shifts, inspiring Jews to be more connected can bring on family disagreements or exacerbate existing rifts. This is especially true when parents of young Jews who may feel threatened by their children's changes. Recognizing the importance of fostering strong relationships between children and parents, what is the proper attitude to approaching this issue? Okay. Well, let me begin with a note from the Rebbe. And this is one of many. This one's just one that came under my hand. As I've in custom, recently I've been showing it. So let me show it. Maybe you can read it. If you can read it, great. If not, I shall read it to you. The Rebbe is writing to someone, to a woman, Shalosh, an answer to her question. It's a question similar to the one that I just posed. You'll see from the answer. B'chlal, the Rebbe writes, in general, Hayras Chazal advise us, or guide us, Shala Adam liyas mu'urav ben habriyas. A person should be mu'urav ben habriyas, means to be a mensch, basically. Mu'urav ben habriyas means sweet among others, among people. Pleasant, someone that people can respect. I'm trying to find the right translation of mu'urav ben habriyas. I think that translates it somewhat. Ubafrat hamesaskim bechinuch. The Rebbe says, but that's in general. Especially those that are involved in education. Shaleim liyas bekiruv gam im heiri hayalodim, that they should be close with and have a relationship also with the parents of the children. Shezem meisiv b'ashpa'asim ala talmidim. Because that will add and increase in their effect and influence on the students. Gam besichas chulin. Also in their, let's say, pedestrian language, meaning common day-to-day discussions, not necessarily divrei Torah. The Rebbe says, "Im eina sicha asura," in a parenthesis he has, which means if it's not, God forbid, a forbidden type of conversation. Efshel lahatis asicha. So also in conventional day-to-day conversations, you can it's possible to move the discussion, to move the conversation. The inyan shatir te'elas boy. So something that there'll be a benefit in this conversation, clearly for the students and for the family. And the proof is because we were commanded, also for regular conversations, in all your ways, you should know God. But it has to be done obviously in non-obvious ways. Blita would mean that stands out, everyone sees you have an agenda. Like it is with all matters of a person. That you don't have to do things in a way in your face type of fashion. I think this answer answers the question, but I'll elaborate a bit. This may have been about a school, because Yalodim, it sounds like children, but it's the same idea. Firstly, for people who are dealing with this, or who are coming into Yiddishkeit and they're having these tensions, remember, part of becoming into Yiddishkeit is also becoming a more refined person. So the first thing is you want to avoid, by all means, any conflict with anyone, especially people in your family who are not used to you. Forget about whether they're judging you or not, but you shouldn't be judging them, because you know better. They may be ignorant, they may have bad experiences, they don't know you as this new person. So you don't have to compromise yourself, but you should be mu'udav ben abriyas. When they see you, they should see a person, wow, my brother, my sister, my son, my daughter, more refined, more loving, more kind. I've never seen them so beautiful. And the more that you beautify them, so v'ahavtas Hashem alekecha, as the Sifri says, that God, make God beloved in the eyes of people, the more beloved you are to them, that itself speaks volumes. You don't have to say much. Now, obviously, if you have cousins or relatives or brothers or siblings who are just create tension, so you can say very pleasantly, I really, I love you. I love my family. I'm no different in that context. If anything, I love you even more. I don't want to have conflict. And if you see a situation where you can't avoid it, you can't avoid, maybe you shouldn't show up, as long as you're not insulting someone. Explain yourself. Yes, you have to go the extra yard, the extra mile to not just ingratiate, but to show that you are living a godly type of life. And get into conflicts is antithetical to the etzem frumkeit thing, because it's also part of the mitzvah, mu'udav ben abriyas. But case by case, to know how to apply that. Now, we're dealing with someone who's inspiring children or young people or adults. Always get the family involved as much as possible. Always ask, what does your father and mother think about this? Find ways. Pesach is coming. It's a very sore spot when children tell their parents, I can't come to you for Pesach. Kosher. There's many ways to say that in loving ways instead of offensive ways. And you have to put yourself in the shoes of your parents. You're rejecting their choices. For good reason, perhaps, but they don't see it yet. So the more loving, the more sensitivity. Sit down. Remember, at the end of the day, they're your parents. You have to learn to explain it. They may have anger. They may be difficult, but you cannot go tit for tat. You cannot. It takes two to tango. You have to always take the high road, and there's no really other option, as I discussed till now. If you need help, you should talk to mashpia, to guide, because sometimes you may say the wrong word, you may offend even further, to know how to say it and so on. Okay. Next question. On the same vein about parents and children. Parents' involvement in their married children's lives. Thank you for your deeply interesting lectures. I have a question. I wish you would talk about the role of parents in the lives of his or her married children. Can you please advise some practical examples? On the one hand, I know I can pray that they always have Yiras Shamayim and find happiness in their lives, but what is my practical role in our relationship? I'm going to assume that there's a healthy relationship and everything is going well. I'll talk about unhealthy relationships in a moment. Basically, your relationship as a parent and child, no matter what happens, no matter how old you are, no matter how old your children are, even if your children become grandparents, is always there. You're still a parent. It's different, however, when you're a parent where you're taking your children to nursery school and to the doctors, and now that your children are parents themselves. So what shifts is not the parenting that you are, it's the way you parent. At this point, you should be proud that your children are able to build their own homes and families. Grandparents are a tremendous resource. So besides just saying Tehillim or praying for the Yiras Shamayim, is to always being there to be helpful. It's always a nachas thing for grandparents to do that, especially if growing family, that type of offering, coming Pesach now or other holidays. Obviously, always in a way that people welcome you in, your children welcome you in, and your in-law welcomes you in. Always pleasant, pleasant, pleasant. And I cannot see how a parent can't find ways to help a child. So many different ways. Help shopping, help financially, help with advice. Now, all non-imposed, not saying I have things to say. You don't like something that your children are doing, that I've discussed in previous episodes, not your business. If you really see it's a real problem, you have to find a way to do it without imposing. Just like you wouldn't want someone imposing on you when you were bringing up your children. But if you talk about it in a healthy, pleasant way, there are hundreds of ways. How can I help you, my darling, if it's a daughter? Or my darling, if it's a son? People go through life that everybody can use more support and help in every possible way. As far as if there are issues between parents and children, and this is now another part of the issue, that's another story. Then it's not about that your children now, how could you help them? It's how can you mend or make your relationship better? That needs to be addressed. But I would not impose, and I just want to make sure that this question is not coming from a place where, because we have issues, how can my children don't want me around, what can I do to get involved? Then you have to figure out, why don't they want you around? They may have a point, maybe they don't have a point, but we have to figure it out. Okay. Next. I prefer my non-frum friend's company. Dear Rabbi, as a bocher, I find it hard to really enjoy my fellow bocherim's company. However, when I go home and I hang out with a non-frum balabatim or friends, I enjoy their company a lot. I feel that they look up to and care about me, as opposed to my friends from yeshiva. Can you explain the difference in how I should fix this? I do believe I should enjoy being around from Chevra. May God give you strength and bless you and your family till 120. Thank you. Okay, I have to answer this based on what I'm reading. I don't know all the circumstances, but let me just make excuse me, a few comments. I don't know why it should be this way. And generally I don't like the word frum, not frum. As I mentioned before with conformity and nonconformity, it's all lefia ish, lefia zman, lefia makom. It's all relative, basically. There are people who are so-called observant, what you call frum, that are very cool and had to hang out with. And there are people who are not, or secular, and very uncool to hang out with. So I'm not sure why your circle happens to be that the people associated with frumkeit happen to be people that you don't enjoy, and the people that are not, you do enjoy. Maybe it's the wrong people you're hanging around with. So that's number one. Number two, I don't see it as a problem. On the contrary, if you see yourself a shliach of Hashem, a shliach of the Rebbe, to influence, so maybe it is you should hang out, not just for your enjoyment, but to influence, to be mashpia, to inspire. But being I don't know who the writer is and all the circumstances, I'm just covering the entire spectrum, as much of the spectrum as I can cover. So I don't see this per se as an issue. Number one, as I said, there are people in the frum world that unfortunately are just there are many reasons. A lot of people don't want to hang out with them. Either they're obnoxious, either they're just mediocre, or they're just non-motivating, they're bitter, they're angry, they're negative. I don't think it has anything to do with their frumkeit. Let's make that very clear. That's who they are. But being that they are frum, it's not pleasant when people want to be with someone that's frum and want to be with my chevra, so to speak. So that's a whole other discussion why that can exist, because the Torah gives us free will, and we have many different options. And bottom line is that people can choose to not integrate and internalize Torah and Yiddishkeit that should make it exciting, that people should want to be around you. But that's another discussion. As far as you go, the person who's asking this question, you have to find such friends because it'll be helpful to you to have people who take Yiddishkeit and Torah and are exciting people to be with. Not just nice, enjoying their company. Exciting, motivating, inspiring, uplifting, challenging. These stimulating, all these words should be associated with Yiddishkeit. Now, if at the end of the day, this is what your situation is, that's why I add that wherever you go, whoever you speak to, balabatim, secular, not secular, your job is to inspire them and stimulate them. Not just hang around with them and be in a receiving end, but also on a giving end. And that makes for a relationship to be far richer and far more mature and far more flourishing. I hope I answered the question. If not, please follow up and write some more. Now, let's go now to the Chassidus question of the week. But before that, I have two follow-ups I want to just briefly address. One was about the Hanochas follow-up. We spoke a number of weeks ago about the process of memorizing, retaining, absorbing, and then writing and reconstructing the Rebbe's Farbrengens, which I had the schus to be part of for a good 16 years of my life. Began around 1976, being involved in the process, even 75, until 1992 when the Rebbe had, unfortunately, the stroke. So that would be a good 16 years. And of course, many of those years writing the Farbrengens as well. So there were many follow-ups, but I want to talk about one. In one of the older classes you said you would return to the issue of the publication of the Rebbe's Hagos on the Sichos. These are the Rebbe's edits on these talks. And if there's a benefit in this, in order to have a deeper understanding of the ideas being transmitted, as well as the added koyach this creates of seeing the Rebbe's edits. I do not think this was returned to yet. Let me briefly state the following. I remember when I was a bocher in yeshiva, before I had the schus to start being involved in the working on the sichos and getting the Rebbe's edits and seeing and asking questions and seeing answers, we used to learn a sicha, a Likutei Sichos that would come out edited from the Rebbe, or a letter that would come out for the Tishrei or Nisan, or different times. We learn it like Torah Messinai, every letter we poured over, every footnote in detail. And I thank God for those days. Why do I thank God? Because there was a certain innocence of just accepting and absorbing it, and helped me understand something that later became very clear to me. When you start working with it, we start working and I started seeing the edits, it didn't in any way, for me, weaken the sanctity of the Rebbe's words and so on. But the fact of the matter is you become more accustomed to it and you don't have that, I don't want to use the word naive, I would say the innocent purity of learning for the first time on my Chassidus properly. And I see many people, when they see the Rebbe's edits, with all the advantages they get over it, in most cases it becomes more sensational. Oh, here the Rebbe edited. So the other lines that he didn't edit are not as valuable. That's the nature of human beings. Now there are, of course, people who are scholars and they study the sichos and then they see the edits, so it helps them add to that. But there's also the other side of it, which explains why the Rebbe, and I know this personally, was not very happy that his edits and all the edits would get out there publicly, for the reason I've just mentioned. I'm sure for other reasons as well, because like it was in the earlier years, the Rebbe would answer people and people would get their answers. Later the Rebbe stopped it because people were writing in just to get the Rebbe's handwriting. So tell me, that means they're not focusing on the answer; they're focusing on getting the handwriting. So it became like a collector's thing, which I understand. The value, the people cherish, better to have a taiva for this than for other things. Absolutely. But to say that you have the same type of geschmack, and the Friedrich Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe actually writes in his Hagdoma to Derech Chaim, he writes, that he knows the minig on Shari Tshuva, I think. He knows the minig of Anash, that when they have a manuscript, they'll learn it much more than when it's printed. Yet he's still printing it because it's going to make it easier to learn. Same idea. Because a manuscript has that, the handwriting, and you see this. So though I understand the value of it, but there's also the other side of it, and I think we have to weigh the two. So when you print a book and you print the beginning of the Chvevusa de Milse, you add a piece because of a manuscript just to show, have a taste, is one thing. I don't know if it's an Indian to go ahead and start publishing every edit and so on. A lot of it is out there anyway, so it's not really up to me regardless, but that's the point I want to make on this. But as far as the Chassidus question, before we get to the actual Chassidus question, let me do a follow-up. I mentioned last week the Maskala, which was the Mishkal, the Kava Mida, Butzina de Cardenisa, the measure, and you could say the weight, like a scale, of how, which is a mashal used in Kabbalah Chassidus to measure the flow of divine energy. And I mentioned Tikla. And I said Tikla, some people think Tikla is Miskal, and the truth is, however, I want to just correct something. There is an idea of Tikla, which is another idea, and it's brought in Zohar, Volume 1, 119a, Kuf Yutes Aleph, and Chassidus is cited, one place, is Ayin Beis, chapter 112. And it refers to High Tikla, the Lashon in Zohar is High Tikla, to the potter's wheel, is Tachras Kameh. That's turning before him. That's an example used how the Eibishter creates the world like a potter's wheel while you're still by the potter is shaping, let's say, a pot made out of clay and shaping it with a potter's wheel like stones that were turning, as the Zohar explains. So this is an example of the Eibishter continues to shape things, Mesabav Sibas, shapes things in existence. It's referring, of course, to light, that we see the mysterious things, that Mashiach was born actually from Bnei Light, Amon Moav, because Moav, Rus, who was the grandmother of David HaMelech, comes from Amon Moav, which was a Bia Asura actually. So this is all part of God's mysterious ways, and we use the potter's wheel, and the Zohar uses the example of again, it's connected also to the flow, but more the flow is how God's mysterious ways of how he maneuvers, and while he's shaping a keli, it could be reshaped. So though it begins one way, it could be reshaped based on circumstances, and you can look up the sources more on this topic. Tikla. Now, Chassidus question. Klipas Nogeh and Shalosh Klipas Atmeis are terms and concepts found throughout Chassidus, beginning with Tanya chapter 6. What do these words mean? What are the three totally impure husks, and how do they differ from one another? Does Klipas Nogeh have only one form, as opposed to Shalosh Klipas Atmeis, which has three? And why is it called Nogeh, which means light? How does light apply to a klipa? Okay. So yes, let's begin with the sources. So in Tanya and Perek Vav, he brings from Merkovis Yecheskel. And let us look inside. What does it say there in Pasuk, Kapitel Aleph, Pasuk Dalad, right in the beginning? Vahibish Leishim Shana, Yecheskel is telling of his vision. Chassidus says this is the world of Kabbalah, the Zohar, and Chassidus explained this is the world of Yetzirah. That's where Yecheskel was Misnava. His prophecy, Yeshaya was in Bria, Yecheskel was in Yetzirah. This is the famous chariot, the Merkava of Yecheskel. And Alter Rebbe actually says, but Merkava is Yecheskel, which is a very high level. That's where we read the following pasuk. What is the pasuk? Ve'era v'hine ruach sa'ara ba min atzofen onan godel ve'esh mislakachas v'negel asaviv u'metecha ke'en hachashmal metecha esh. Translated. I saw and behold, there was a stormy wind or tempest coming from the north, a great cloud, and a flashing fire, and a brightness around it. And from its midst, it was like the color of the chashmal from the midst of the fire. And then he says, within this midst, he saw the Daled Chayes HaMarkava, the four faces of the chariot. And so the Zohar, in a number of places, and I'll give you the sources. Let's start with this. The Zohar, Volume 2, 203a, Volume 3, 227a, and at length the Ramak in Pardes Shad HaTmuris, which is Shad 25, chapter 7, and a number of other places, in Zohar and in other places, talks about that this is what's called the Shalosh Klipas Atmeis. And the fourth Klippa being Klipas Nogeh. Now what does Klippa mean? Klippa means a husk, a shell. And the shell often explained in Chassidus is the shell of the Agus, also based on Zohar, the nut shell. Now is not a place to discuss, but I want to just throw it out there. If anybody has familiarity with the idea of the 4 types of husks, 4 layers of husks in a nut, how that fits to the nuts of our time, which nut are we talking about, a walnut or other types of nuts, I'd love to hear from you. I've been looking around. It's somewhat of an aside. But anyway, what is a husk? A husk has 2 opposites. On one hand, it protects the fruit within. In this case, the nut within. On the other hand, you discard it after you eat. You eat the nut. The meat of the nut, that is. So the Shalosh explains, based on Zohar and so on, based on this idea, Kelipat kodma lepri, first comes the Kelipat, and the whole world therefore is called husks, because within it lies the fruit called the divine energy. Now, the Kelipas Nogeh, let's start with the last one, is called Nogeh because it's a transparent husk. I explained about the nut that you have a very slight membrane and around the nut itself, and often you can eat it. You're not going to eat the other part of the shell, but that little membrane that comes around like a grape. Think of a grape also has a membrane. You can eat a grape without peeling the grape. There are fruits you won't, or nuts, but there are those you do. Why? Because it's transparent. It still lets the light, so to speak. You can still see the fruit within that husk. That's why it's Kelipas Nogeh. That's why it's called either transparent or luminescent or bright. Kelipas Nogeh. You can say it's called, maybe a good way to put it is, I'm just looking here for a nice way to express it. It'll come to me. I'm trying to find a good expression for Kelipas Nogeh. Okay, but the bottom line is it's a transparent type of shell. The other Kelipas, on the other hand, the husks are hard. And one harder than the next. There are levels. They're not 3 equal. Now, in the Zohar and the Parshas and other places, Kisra Rizal, compare these 4, 3 and 1 you can say, also to the expression in Eliyahu Novi's vision, where it talks in Malachim Aleph, Yud Aleph and Beis, the famous posuk. The Eibishter tells him to go out there and stand. V'hinei Hashem ovar v'ruach gdele v'chozak mefarek harim u'meshaber sloim lefnei Hashem lei beruach Hashem v'achar haruach rash lei berash Hashem v'achar harash eish lei be'esh Hashem v'achar eish kel demo medaka. Hashem tells Eliyahu, go out and stand by the mountain before Hashem. God will pass, and a great and strong wind splitting mountains and shattering boulders before Hashem. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind was a rash, an earthquake or a thunder. Not in the earthquake was Hashem. After the earthquake was fire. Not in the fire was Hashem. And after the fire was a kel demo medaka, a still small sound. So they compare these 4 literally with the 4 that I just described. With the wind, starting with the wind being the ruach, then comes the onon in Cheskel, which is the cloud, is similar to the rash, and finally the eish, the fire, the flaming fire, and the kel demo medaka is compared to Kelipas Nogeh. This is also, the Zohar says in Bereshis Daf Tezayin 16a. Explains this is all the 4 things in the beginning of Bereshis, second posuk. Va'eretz ha'isa toyu, v'voihu, v'cheshach al pnei hasahem. So you have toyu, voihu, and cheshach. Sometimes tohim is considered the 4th, but sometimes v'ruach elakim erachevas al pnei hamayim. That's the kel demo medaka. There's different ways it's explained. The point is that this idea is all over the place, and the ultimate explanation between it is that Kelipas Nogeh, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, is a intermediate between Kedusha and Shalosh Klipas Atmeis. Most of the things we do in life is Kelipas Nogeh. Why? Because it is a husk. Let's say you're eating kosher food. But will this be eaten l'shem shamayim, to get stronger and do mitzvahs? Will it be eaten neutrally for no particular reason except fulfilling your hunger? Or will it be, God forbid, used for something negative? So Kelipas Nogeh is a klipa, but it's a klipa that can go either way. You can eat it, as I gave the example with the nut, it's just a membrane, and the fruit is seen in it, or you could just see, no, I'm going to focus on the husk and not on the fruit. So that's essentially Kelipas Nogeh. The other 3 that correspond to the 3 that I just said, which is the wind, the cloud, and the fire, are the three Klipas Atmeis. And the Rebbe has a very interesting letter printed in Igros Kodesh, Volume 1, from Tafshin Gimel, it looks like, to Rabbi Greenglass, where he discusses this Tanya at length. And is discussing, because the Tanya does not bring the Eish Mislakachas, just says V'gemer. So Rabbi Greenglass wanted to suggest that maybe the Alter Rebbe was learning that the Ruach Sa'ara is two. So you have Ruach, Ruach Sa'ara is one, is two, Ruach is one, Sa'ara is a third, and then the Onan Gadol is the third. The Rebbe says no, he negates that, even though there is some room to argue that way, and says no, that it means Eish, because that's how it's most cases. You can look up the letter in detail, and the Rebbe explains it with several comments. But then what he also says, why does the Alter Rebbe say Merkavah Shecheska? Because it comes to add that even Klipas, even the Shalosh Klipas Atmeis, even the most negative, are all rooted in the Merkavah, in a divine place. So it's a concept in Chassidus. How does Kelipat become Kelipat? The Rebbe refers to a mimer from Tzemach Tzedek, L'Havani Nabrachas, that explains how did it evolve from holiness to Kelipat. Klipas Nogeh, of course, is the key because it's the intermediary. Because it begins as a husk. A husk is not a negative thing if you know it's a husk to protect the fruit. It becomes negative when you see it as an end in itself. And then the Rebbe says, I did not find in Chassidus an explanation of the three Gimel Klipas Atmeis except in Likutei Torah Masei. There he says that the three Klipas Atmeis, the ones that are closer to Klipas Nogeh, which seems like the last one, Eishas Milkachas, the flaming fire, seems closer. So there it's not as harsh. And as you go further, the Onan, and even further to the Ruach Sa'ara, that is harsher Klipas. But the Rebbe goes into a whole discussion which is really the harshest, because it appears in different places in Kabbalah and Chassidus, different ways to explain it. Okay. That's the letter, page 70 through 72 in Igros Kodesh, Volume 1. A few more things I want to just throw into the picture since we're talking about it. The Tzemach Tzedek, also in a number of places, explains Klipas Nogeh, he says, is a klipa where it's just to use his words, the hargish esatzmei. Neged atzilus means it's a klipa. It's not negative, but you sense yourself already. Once you start sensing a sense of self, is the beginning of what can become something far worse when you start saying there's nothing but me. So you still sense the divine, he says, but Nogeh means that it's you margish it. And he brings example of colors that you can sense the color. They're still the colors of the light, but they're already the beginning of the birth of an ego has been born. That's one point. That's in Zehar, B'yirei HaZeher, page Reish Tzadik Zayin, 297. That's one point I want to bring. Another point is in Parshas Kisov in Eira Teira, page 8, Taf Reish Tzadik Gimel. That would be 1093. He speaks about the levels in Shalosh Klipas Atmeis as well, and you can maybe derive something from that as well. And finally, I want to bring in Eretei Mates, page 1304, where he talks as well about the concept of this whole idea of Klipas Nogeh being an intermediary interface between the three Klipas, the harsh Klipas and so on. Now, at the end of the day, Shalosh Klipas Atmeis are husks. Husks themselves also protect, but they're not meant to be in any way directly experienced. You don't eat them, you discard them. Why they call Shalosh Klipas Atmeis? Because they're dvorim asurim, as the Alter Rebbe explains. Asurim b'idei chitzenim. They are not in control of the fruit, they're in control of the material world. And by breaking them, shvirosan, by breaking them, that's how you actually reveal the fruit. And they too will ultimately be transformed, as the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 6 and 7 of Tanya. What else can I add to this? If there's more, I will definitely share more. Again, I hope I did some justice to this topic. Let us now sum up with essays. 3 essays. Accessing the Perfect Tools by Mati Hecht, age 42, Monsey, New York. So her essay is, if your only tool is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail, quoting Maslow. And discussing how to get beyond the narrow toolbox that we have in the world at which we live. She describes society is bombarded with subjective media reports, social media, And our toolbox is most of us are reaching for the hammer and perceive that's our only life tool, being a metaphor for this specific life tool based on what we know in this world that we live in. We say, I was born this way and therefore entitled, nay, mandated to act this way. Furthermore, you need to accept and embrace me and my actions. Better yet, join me in my parade. In other words, we don't think that we have anything outside of the tool chest that we have. And she goes on in a very creative way saying, no, you also have a wrench, for man is born to toil. You have a plier, a soul descends into this world. In order to achieve something, you have a screwdriver to dig deeper. And she goes into a very interesting discussion based on Chassidus, how you get beyond your own limitations based on Basel Lagani Tovshin Yud, the purpose of creation, of how we can access deeper tools and greater tools rather than the narrow tools that most of us think we have. That's essay number 1. Essay number 2 is The Powerful Eye by Mendel Bergstein, age 21, Aholoteda, Oak Park, Illinois. And Nachum Mendel Bergstein, he talks about whether our actions are significant or not. And that's a question that everybody will wonder at times. Are my actions really important? Do they really make a difference? And when you don't feel they do, it's definitely a source of discouragement. Goes into using Tanya, Karev Elecha Adover Me'ed, and what Tanya Chassidus talk about this question, and ultimately teaching us that we are the importance of our Veda, the importance of our standing as God's emissaries, ambassadors in changing this world. It's the central theme of it. And again, you can read this and the other essays at meaningfullife.com/essays. Finally, the third essay by Yoel Baich, The Power is So Good It Feels Like Sin, The Power of Independent Free Will. It's in Hebrew. Yoel Baich, age 31, Rishon LeZion, Israel. This is really the power of free will. A very interesting essay that challenges our perception of why we see people behave in ways that are really sometimes very ugly. And we look at ourselves, how could we behave in a certain way? And we say, how is that possible? And to the point that we live in a society where certain things you can do, it says it's so good it feels like sin. To say that sin should feel good. The irrationality basically of envy, of ugly midas, ugly personality characteristics and so on. And essentially goes with a computer analogy, using an analogy of computer, that this is all about free will. The ability, the power that you can either press, that you have the power to press the enter button or the escape button. And imagine if it got reversed. The idea that we have the power to change this world through the fact that God created us in a way that gave us His individual power of free will. Interesting essay as well, provocative. And with that, we did the 3 essays. The other essays are being, this year's essay contest is being judged. We're getting closer to the final round, and you will hear more about it. I want to conclude, may everyone have a very simcha-dika week, talking about simcha. Chedesh Adar, mismar geula legeula, going from Purim to Pesach, to be a kosher and freilich Pesach, as the Rebbe says, and it says in Halacha, actually, Shloshim Yom Kedem HaChag, we're ready after the 30 days before Pesach, where we begin preparing, first of all, through studying the laws, preparing our minds, our souls, our spirits, and above all in our personal life, the ability to clean out the ego and the chometz, and reach a level of bittul, healthy bittul, that helps us appreciate and achieve true transcendence, true Yetzias Mitzrayim. This has been MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 109. Until next Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m., everyone have a very blessed week. Thank you.